Hey everybody, Pastor Kevin Swann here again, and we are in the book of Ruth, going through a chapter by chapter study, and today we're examining Ruth chapter 2. Ruth chapter 1 was incredible, but if you like Ruth chapter 1, Ruth chapter 2, I guarantee you will be even better. If ever you've wondered how relationships should exist between Christians, how God works behind the scenes, how God can work things out even when we're going through difficult times, this is the Bible study for you. I don't even want to delay. I want to jump in right now. Make sure you read Ruth chapter 2 before you start. Download the Bible study worksheet, and let's jump in right now with Ruth chapter 2.
And we're ready to get started with Ruth chapter 2. As a reminder, there are some goals that we want to get accomplished in this short series, just three lessons, and we're covering 4 chapters in 3 lessons. And we want to make sure that, number one, we want to see how God works in our lives behind the scenes. So many times we don't always notice or see just how God is moving. And sometimes God moves without our knowledge, without our understanding. He can put our names on the hearts of people that we don't even know to come and bless us. So we have to trust that God works behind the scenes. Number 2, we want to show how God has a plan for us, even in times of despair. God never said that our life would be exempt from challenge and difficulty, heartache sometimes, disappointment, but that even in those things, Jeremiah 29:11, Romans 8, for all things work together for the good. All of these things help us to realize God indeed has a plan for us even in our darkest moments. Number 3, which we're going to talk about today, how Christian relationships should be handled. Unfortunately, for many people who get saved, we get saved, but never have been taught or never understood how Christian relationships should work, how to meet and date and all those kinds of things. And so what we end up doing is being saved and going to church, but still have unsaved tendencies and worldly tendencies, even though we're saved. And so we have to carefully look at that and see what's God's design. And then finally, we want to see the kindness of God through the redemption of his people. And redemption means to buy back, but it also means to change the course of action. Because Christ redeemed us by his blood, we were destined for the grave and destined for hell. But he changed our course of action and allows us now to have a new life in him. And that's so very important. And so I want us to make sure that we understand these 4 points as we are reading the book of Ruth, because God definitely is not always in the forefront of the book, but quietly working behind the scenes and allowing things to happen. As a quick review of Ruth 1, we know that there was a family that left Bethlehem and went to Moab because of a famine in the land. And we know that Bethlehem literally means house of bread. So they left the house of bread where there was sustenance because there was a famine in the land to go to the enemy's territory. And while in Moab, the husband and 2 sons die. So it was a family of 4, husband, wife, 2 sons. And the husband, Elimelech, whose name literally means my God is king, and the 2 sons, Mahlon, which means sickly, and Chilion, which means pining one, they die, leaving the mother or the wife, whose name is Naomi, and her name means pleasant. Well, after 10 years of being in Moab, she hears that the famine is over, and she makes the decision to return home. While in Moab, her 2 sons did get married, and so now the daughters-in-law initially want to return to Bethlehem with Naomi, but Naomi convinces them to stay in Moab. But Ruth, however, was determined to go back home with Naomi, and so she did. And upon returning to Bethlehem, the Bible says that the women and the people in the city were so happy to see her. After 10 years, Naomi said, "Don't call me Naomi now, but call me Mara," which means bitter. She left one way, came back another. And chapter 1 covers a 10-year period. Now, one thing that we want to make sure we understand in Ruth chapter 1, verses 16 to 18 is that this statement that Ruth gives to Naomi is critical. It says that she replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. And may the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. Now, what is striking about this confession that Ruth gives to Naomi is this actually is what salvation should look like. Unfortunately, sometimes in churches, we reduce salvation to just repeating words after me and making sure that you're saved. But there has to be in those words a commitment, a vow from the heart that this is what we're pledging to do. And so we hope then that in the text it says, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. I will go where you go. So in other words, there's a clear reference here that no matter what happens going forward, I'm willing to leave my family, I'm willing to leave friends, I'm willing to leave my country, and I'm willing to serve not only you, Naomi, but I'm also willing to serve your God. That is really what salvation should look like, where we as believers today may be willing to leave father or mother, brother or sister, boyfriend, girlfriend, whomever, and enter into another space where we trust in this God. And it's only when we have this level of commitment that we begin to see how and why God blessed Ruth the way he did. Because Ruth was wholeheartedly committed to not only Naomi, but she was also committed to the work of the Lord. And keep in mind, she was a foreigner. She was from Moab, going back to a place that she had never seen before, never been to before, and yet she was willing to go there to not only serve Naomi, but to serve God as well. This is critical to understand when we look at Ruth, because too many times we just think that Ruth got blessed because of Boaz. No, Ruth didn't get blessed simply because of Boaz. Ruth got blessed because she was committed to the God of the Israelites, even though she was a foreigner. And God honored her commitment. And if there was anything that was a great challenge in today's time, it is that, especially in relationships, there is a complete lack of commitment long term. Now you look at it here, and she says, where you die, I'm going to die. And if let the Lord deal with me severely if even death separates you and me. In other words, no matter what happens, I'm committed to staying with you, staying with your God, and we're going to work this thing and ride it out until one of us dies. Isn't that really what it's supposed to be? Isn't that representative of what marriage should look like? Where we have a man and a woman that says, I'm pledging myself to you for the rest of my life. But when we look at marriages today, we see divorce rates are high. And so here is a clear example of what salvation should look like. It is a foreshadowing. Having said that, let's go ahead into chapter 2. And what we see now is that upon arriving in Bethlehem, Naomi and Ruth are desperate. Now remember, both of their husbands have died. They don't have a covering anymore, which means that they have nobody to care for them. And we know that in those times, women's rights were very different than today. So Ruth comes up with the idea that she would go out into the fields and glean for some grain and get the leftovers from the reapers. And Naomi agreed, because really there was no other option. Let's go out here. Let's see if I can find some food, because otherwise we're going to starve. What are the chances that it just so happens that of all the fields of which Ruth could have chosen, because remember, Ruth doesn't know anybody other than Naomi. Of all the fields that she chose, she ended up in the field that belonged to a man named Boaz. Now, I know that I hear it a lot. People say, particularly women, I want a Boaz man. I want a Boaz man. Well, we're going to talk about Boaz today. But I just want you to see how the hand of God is already moving in this context. Out of all the fields that could have been chosen, Ruth ends up in the field belonging to the man named Boaz. Now, why is gleaning the fields important? Now, gleaners are people who collected the grain of the harvest. That's simply what gleaners were. They collected the harvest. Okay? The reason why this is so important is because we need to first understand Deuteronomy 24:19, where God gives the command to the people. And he tells the people, when you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf, in other words, as you're going along and you're gathering your harvest, and let's say some of the sheaves, some of the grain happens to fall down and you don't get it all up, you shall not go back to get it. In other words, if it falls out of your bucket, don't be so quick to jump down and pick it up. Don't be so concerned with collecting every little bit. God says, for the ones that dropped out of your bucket when you harvest, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. Ruth was a widow. Ruth also was a stranger. And you could make the argument that Ruth had left her father in Moab, so she was fatherless as well. So she could fit all of these categories. That the Lord may bless you in all the work of your hands. Now this was for the one who owned the field. So clearly Boaz had to have had something like this in his mind if he was a man of God. If we're harvesting the field, which is what was taking place in chapter 2, and we miss some, don't be so quick to get it. Let it go. Somebody who needs it will be blessed. And coincidentally, this also would suggest today that everything that we get in our life is not just for us. That sometimes God gives us things and there's some left over we shouldn't fuss about because it should be for others who need the same blessing. But if I am so consumed in getting every little thing that comes my way, then that means that the next person who it was assigned for can't get their blessing. And if they can't get their blessing, then maybe God reserves the right to withhold my blessing. So what am I saying here? There's a blessing in giving. There's a blessing in leaving some a little bit left over so that you can bless other people. And here is the clear principle that we see in Deuteronomy 24. Now here's what happens. The word Boaz, or his name, literally means alacrity, or a cheerful readiness. This represents now what made on some level Boaz such an attractive person, because his name suggests that he was ready and cheerfully willing to want to help people that were in need. Now, Ruth and Naomi needed help right away. If there was anybody that needed to be ready to help somebody, no questions asked, be a blessing, and be happy doing it, it was Boaz. That's who Ruth and Naomi needed in the moment. They had no food, come from a foreign land, they're trying to get settled in, and here comes Boaz. Now let me ask you, what are the chances that of all the fields that Ruth could have selected, Ruth ends up in the field that belongs to a man who is cheerfully and willingly ready to help somebody in need? All I'm trying to tell you is that God continues to work behind the scenes. And this is what he does. God will send people to you and put you in the position at the right place, at the right time, in the right situation to bless your life, because God specializes in working behind the scenes. I just want to encourage somebody who's going through. How many times has God sent you somebody that maybe you didn't even know that was a blessing to you in the moment that you needed it? Here's the same thing that's happening, that Ruth and Naomi needed help immediately. And it just so happened that Boaz, whose name means cheerful readiness, was there to meet their need. So here's the story. And here's what we now understand are the qualities of Boaz. And I know, because women talk to me all the time, you know, most African-American churches are predominantly women, so I have these discussions with women all the time and what to look for in a man. Now notice I'm not necessarily limiting this, because men, these are some of the things also that we should be working on that will make us more attractive and more appealing to other people as well. I'm not talking about the girls who are the strays, the one that you really not serious about, the one that you can get whatever you want from and there really is no consequence for it because they're just happy that you're in their life. No, I'm talking about the woman that you really want to go after, the one that you really see that makes you want to be better, makes you want to step your game up. Here are the qualities that need to have. Number one, he was a distant relative of Elimelech, which was Naomi's husband, which worked in the favor. Number one, he had great wealth. And let me just say here that wealth is not always linked to financial blessing. Wealth can also mean health and strength. And too many times what I notice is that people tend to choose people on the basis of how much they have right now. Well, how much they have right now is no indicator on what they're going to have in the future. It just means that that's what they have right now. And too many women fall for material things as a condition of whether or not the man is qualified to be in your life. Just because people have possessions don't mean they're nice. Just because people have possessions, that don't mean they won't cuss you out or mistreat you or abuse you. They just have stuff. And we need to recognize the difference between the two. Not only did he have great wealth, but he had a godly disposition. When you look at verse number 4, keep in mind he is the owner of the field. He walks up to the workers of the field, and he doesn't talk to them any kind of way. He doesn't mistreat them. He doesn't call them out of their name. He doesn't say, hey, you. When you look at verse number 4, it clearly says that when he addressed them, he said, may the Lord be with you. And they responded, and the Lord bless you. Having wealth is one thing. Knowing where it came from and staying humble and appreciating the fact that God has blessed you is somebody else. And that is the qualities that people should have and should recognize. He was obedient to God's word. We already talked about Deuteronomy 24:19. He instructed his workers to leave certain things behind. Don't collect everything, because what we leave behind is for the poor, for those to get blessed. And then also he inquired about Ruth, and the servants connected her with Naomi. So before he even went to Ruth, he asked those who were there, who is this young woman? That's verse 5. And in verse 6, those who worked for him explained that this is Ruth, the one that came home with Naomi, the one who committed to being with her and taking care of her while she was here. Now, what made Boaz so appealing to Ruth? Women, pay close attention to this slide. Men, pay close attention to this slide. If you are single and you're looking to be in a committed, serious relationship with somebody, this is the direction from a biblical place of which you should consider. And if you're married, these are the qualities that should exist in marriage, such that the marriage is going in the proper direction. Number 1, Boaz had a plan for Ruth. If you look at verse number 8, when he meets her at the very introduction of meeting her, he says, don't go into any other fields. Stay behind the certain young women and make sure you follow them, and you will be blessed. It is clear that because Boaz was connected to God and he was ready to help and be cheerful and willing to help, he also had a plan. Ladies, do not get involved in a serious relationship with any man who doesn't have a plan. Men, when you are ready to be in a serious relationship with somebody, the one thing you should be sharing with them is not how much money you make, not what you drive, not where you live, but you should be communicating your plan, because your plan will then determine who your helpmate is going to be. You wouldn't need a helpmate if you didn't have a plan. And the plan doesn't come from you. The plan comes from God. So God gives you the plan. Your responsibility is to communicate the plan to other people. Then you will know who is really supposed to be with you, because some women may not want to buy into your plan. And then that's how you know. But the first thing and the most important thing a man has to have is a clear plan for where he is going. Because if you don't, and you get in a relationship with somebody, you're going in circles. And then after ladies, you have given him everything you could, including your body. And after you've done all these things with no plan in the relationship, the question you're going to ask after 3 months or after 6 months, I guarantee you, is where are we going? What are we doing with this relationship? That is the clear sign that that relationship has no plan. The very first thing Boaz does to Ruth is establish a plan for how she is going to get blessed. And so, number 2, he protected Ruth. He says in verse 9, I have commanded the young men to stay away from you. Now, young men, they probably mess with some of the other Hebrew girls, but he made it clear, if you're going to be in my field, you're not going to mess with Ruth. And he protected her. Guys, one of the main responsibilities and one of the things you need to understand about women is that they feel most comfortable in a relationship when they feel emotionally secure and emotionally stable. That comes in how you protect and keep them. This isn't about money. This is about them being in a good space. And consequently, ladies, if you don't feel protected and emotionally secure in the relationship, then he's not honoring you the way he needs to. That needs to be addressed. Then number 3, he provided for Ruth. He says, when you're thirsty, go and drink as much water as you want, and it's all taken care of. Now, I understand in today's generation, women make more money than men in some cases, but that doesn't mean that men still can't provide and protect on certain levels. Here is what made Boaz so appealing. Not only was he godly and had a godly disposition, not only did he have wealth, but he had a clear plan. He protected Ruth and he provided for Ruth. And here is how I know that Ruth responded, because verse 10 says, after all of this, she fell down to the ground and she began to bow down at Boaz in appreciation for what he was doing. And she asked the question, why are you so nice to me? Why have I found favor in your sight? Most women would look at this and say, this is too good to be true. Or some other women would say, you know what, he's doing this because he wants something from me. He wants to have sex with me, or he's out to get something. There's no indication in the text that Boaz did any of this for sexual favors. He did it because that's what a man, a godly man, is supposed to do when he enters or is considering entering into a relationship. I hope this is helping somebody. Now, keep in mind, why was Boaz so nice to Ruth? Because Boaz had already heard what she did for Naomi, and the Lord was going to pay her back for her efforts. Now, the key verse is verse number 12, because it says she was also willing to find refuge in the God of Israel and come up under his wings. So, because Ruth was faithful to Naomi and to Naomi's God, and because Ruth was willing to leave her home and trust in Naomi and in Naomi's God, God then sends Ruth to the right field of the man who has the right heart, who is willing to do nice things and also be a blessing to Ruth and Naomi. I'm just trying to tell you, when you are committed and faithful to God's work, he will bless you in return. And now we see the kindness of Boaz as it continues. He allows Ruth to eat with the reapers. That never happens. He allows her to glean not just from the corners of the fields, but now in better places so she can collect more food. And now we see that she collected an ephah of barley that day. That is the equivalent of 1.5 months of food. In the morning, she goes with nothing. She comes back, she has enough food to last her 1.5 months. Now, what we need to understand about this is because, I know some women might be listening to this video and say, yeah, that's the kind of man I want. And the man may say, yeah, whatever the case might be. But we need to understand Boaz from a biblical place. And to do that, we need to understand what Christ is saying. In John chapter 5, verses 39 to 44, particularly verse 39, Jesus says that the scriptures testify of me. That's key to understand. Because if the scriptures testify of Christ, and this is what Christ said, that the scriptures testify of me, the New Testament wasn't written at that time, which meant that it was the Old Testament that testified of Jesus, which means that when you read the Bible and you read the Old Testament, you should be able to see how Christ exists in every book of the Old Testament. Now, what's key to understand is that even in the Old Testament, we can find Christ through what is called types. And types are people or situations that resemble the work and nature of Christ. This is critical to understand. When we read Ruth, what we also see is that Boaz is a type of Christ. And we should see clearly that what Boaz did for Ruth and Naomi is the exact same thing that Jesus Christ did and still does for us today. I want to show you how this works. To the left, all the characteristics of Boaz, and to the right, all the characteristics of Christ. So Boaz's name means cheerful readiness. Christ is always willing to save those who want it. Boaz was wealthy. Christ created the heavens and the earth. Boaz had a plan for Ruth. Christ has a plan for mankind. Boaz protected Ruth from the young men. Christ protects us against our enemies. Boaz provided food and water for her and for Naomi. Doesn't our Christ supply all of our needs according to his riches and glory in Christ Jesus? And what we're going to get to in the next video is very, very important. Boaz was Naomi and Ruth's kinsman redeemer, and Christ is also our kinsman redeemer. So when we look at Ruth now, what we see, the book of Ruth, we see a clear distinction that Boaz is a type of Christ. And Ruth then could be demonstrated as a type of the church or the body of believers, those who are called to leave their old ways and come up under the wings of God and come up under the new ways of Christ. Now notice this, for every woman that says that they want a Boaz man, what you are really saying is you want a Christ-like man, because Boaz is a type of Christ. Therefore, if you really want a Boaz and you don't see Christ in the one that you're dating, that person can never be a Boaz to you, because Christ is not evident in who they are or what they are doing. Ooh, this has been a good Bible study today. I hope you've enjoyed it. Here's the closing points. Number one, God can work behind the scenes to turn your situation around in one day. I just want to encourage you. Chapter 1 was 10 years. Chapter 2 was one day. Ruth goes out in the morning with nothing. That night she comes back and she has enough for 1.5 months. I don't care what you've been through, and I don't care how long. God can turn your situation around in one day. God can also put you in the right places and in the right time for you to receive your blessings. Outward appearances and material possessions, ladies and gentlemen, do not tell the whole story of if you should be involved with someone. Here's how you know you should be involved with someone. Do they have a godly position? Do they have a plan? Are they able to protect? Are they able to provide? Are they obedient to the word of God? When you see that, then you know you have something to work with. God honored Ruth's faithfulness and commitment to Naomi because she wanted to be under the wings of the living and true God. And finally, all it takes is to see the hand of God moving in your life to get your joy back. Remember, Naomi entered the chapter calling herself Mara. But when Ruth came home and saw that she had 1.5 months of food, and then found out who blessed her was a man named Boaz, whom she was related to, she started putting the pieces together and started realizing the Lord is working things out. Beloved, I just want to tell you, no matter what you're going through, even in moments of despair, don't lose your faith, because you can get your joy back when you see the hand of God working in your life. This concludes today's Bible study on Ruth chapter 2. I hope that it was a blessing to you.
Whew. What an incredible lesson today. Lots of things to think about. How we should be able to relate to people. If you're single, what you should be looking for when you're choosing a mate, as a female and as a man, what things you should be working on if you really want to capture that person who is right for you. And most importantly, there's something to be said about commitment and faithfulness to God. Because if Ruth wasn't either of those things, I don't believe God would have presented Boaz into her life. So there's something to be said about hanging in there, even in hard times, and trusting that God is going to work everything out. I hope you enjoyed today's Bible study. Next time, we're going to finish the book of Ruth, chapters 3 and 4, all at the same time. Until the next time, be blessed and be a blessing to someone else. Take care.